So you want to get into tarp camping. That's great. I think a tarp is a really fun choice in shelter. They have a lot of benefits, and certainly they have a little bit of downsides as well, which we'll get into. So in this video, I want to talk about how to use a tarp, the benefits, the downsides, all the little details, tricks, hacks, whatever you want to call them. So I know a lot of people are going to look at this and think, that is not a shelter, that is absolutely insane. Why would you ever use that instead of a tent or instead of a motorhome or whatever else you like to take camping? And so, advantages of tarps. Let's talk about that before the disadvantages. First and foremost, this is the absolute lightest shelter you're ever going to get. There's nothing lighter. There's no tent that even sort of comes close to this. So with tents, you're looking at about 1 pound, 16 ounces at the absolute lightest if you're gonna spend a lot of money. And more than likely, on average, you're looking at closer to like 2 pounds or something like that. Now, by comparison, this tarp weighs 5.9 ounces. So this is 3 times lighter than the absolute lightest tent that I own. And frankly, this isn't even the lightest tarp that I've ever used. So it's pretty significant to be able to save like 2 pounds from your pack weight by changing to a shelter like this. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I liked them in the beginning. Now, another thing I really love about tarps is the variety of ways that you can set them up. You know, this is essentially a 9x7 flat sheet. It is just a large rectangle, and you have to shape it into the shape of a shelter, of a tent. So there's all sorts of different crazy ways that you can set up a tarp, but what I like is just the small changes. You know, if the weather is looking good, I can have it much higher up, I can raise the sides, I can have it more open and airy. Or if it's raining, I can pitch it lower and closer to the ground. I can pitch it in ways where I'm integrated with boulders, with bushes, with trees, you know, and kind of allowing the natural environment around me to do some of the work for me. It's like doing origami, but with a shelter, and I really love that. Now, the next thing I really like about tarps is, despite their extreme lightweight, there's a ton of space underneath them. You know, this is only a 7x9, this is basically as small as you want to go, and yet it's got a lot more space under it than any of my tents. And if I was going with a 9x10 or a 10x10 or even larger than that, the weight still stays really low, but the space is just massive. And there's so many different ways that you can pitch it and do it to give yourself even more space. Now, one of the things that I liked the most when I first got into tarp camping, and what really sold me on tarp camping, was when you're underneath them, you get to enjoy the outdoors. You actually get to see your surroundings. You get to look off at the flowers, you get to watch the sunset without having to open and close doors. I liked that it made me feel more connected to the environment that I was in. Now, I also like that tarps can be a really awesome budget option. So personally, that's what made tarps so accessible to me in the beginning, was that I only paid like $50. I could just try it with very little drawback. You know, I wasn't having to spend an arm and a leg just to give it a shot. So for people on a budget, people who want to get into backpacking and camping but don't want to spend $200+ on a shelter, I think a tarp is an awesome option. Now, surely there's a lot more advantages out there, but I'll just do one more before getting into the disadvantages. So the final advantage kind of here is that in a lot of environments, you just don't really need anything more. A lot of environments, you could just be cowboy camping, and all you really need is kind of an emergency shelter. In which cases, a tarp is really going to thrive because it weighs so little and it packs down so small that you just don't really even notice you have it. Whereas if you're carrying a tent, you're carrying all this weight, all this bulk for potentially no reason. So those are the benefits of a tarp in my mind. I kind of feel like looking at it doesn't really look like much, but using it is like a full-on, totally different experience camping than what you would ever get with a tent, and that's something really cool. All right, let's talk about some disadvantages now, because there's a lot of people out there where a tarp just isn't going to be for them, and that's fine. You know, as you'll see over the years, I use tents loads as well. There's a lot of environments, a lot of places, and just a lot of times where I don't feel like using a tarp. So the first disadvantage is simply that it's a little bit more difficult to use a tarp than a tent. A tent Every single night, you're setting it up the exact same way. It's the exact same routine. It's going to be the exact same every single night. So a tarp is a little bit more complicated, and for some people, that's just not really what they want. Now, the other, probably the biggest disadvantage of a tarp is mosquitoes and bugs and things along those lines. Now, there's lots of little tricks you can do with the tarp to kind of mitigate the bugs, like setting up in a windy location so that the bugs just get blown away. That sounds like a joke, but it really works. You can set up away from water sources, lakes, rivers, and streams, because that's where the bugs breed. So if you're camping higher up in a drier place or away from water, there's going to be less bugs. Sometimes you just don't want to consider those things, and maybe we come back to the complicated part. You know, I best not camp at this beautiful lake location because there's going to be more bugs there possibly. You want to camp where you want to camp. Probably the worst mosquitoes I've ever seen in my life. And unfortunately, just when I'm filming the tarp video. So this is an opportunity to bring a tent. Sometimes a tarp is just not the best option. But also, it's not like this all the time on every trail, everywhere. So a lot of times, tarp is great, just not here today. So when it comes to buggy environments, a tarp is just not going to be the best option. So then, when would you use a tarp instead of a tent? When is a tarp going to be better? So the big one then, obviously, is when there aren't a lot of bugs, a tarp is going to be better. Because then you don't need to be carrying all that extra bug netting if bugs don't exist in that area. So say maybe the southern sections of the Pacific Crest Trail, maybe the Arizona Trail, or really any kind of like drier environment where there just aren't a lot of mosquitoes or things. Even if you live in a place with a lot of bugs, a lot of seasons during the year don't have a lot of bugs. So even if you're on the Appalachian Trail, yeah, in June and July, it's going to be gnarly out there, and you definitely don't want a tarp. But then maybe in like February and March, and then like October, November, December, like there aren't a lot of bugs. So if there aren't a lot of bugs, a tarp is going to be better than a tent, because you just don't need to carry that extra weight of all that bug netting. Now, another time you may not want to use a tarp and instead bring a tent is if you're going to be camping above tree line frequently. Now, if you're camping in places with trees, with rocks, with bushes, like you probably are, say 95% of the time, then a tarp can utilize those for extra protection. So this open side here, not only can I pin my tarp lower to the ground, but I can also pitch my tarp next to a tree, which is going to help shield me on this side, or a bush, or a rock. So places with bugs, a tarp probably isn't going to be the best, and if you're going to be above tree line just constantly, probably a tent is going to be a little bit better. But for me, every other instance, I find that I would rather have a tarp. Now, tarps come in all forms of different shapes and sizes. So the most simple of them all is just a flat tarp. It is either going to be a big rectangle or a big square. You don't want to go any smaller than 7 by 9, and you don't really want to go any larger than, say, like 10 by 10. Any larger, and you're kind of getting into the territory of it's unnecessarily large, and any smaller than 7 by 9, and you're just not giving yourself enough protection. So flat tarps are personally what I like the most because you can set them up in so many different ways, because it's just a flat sheet that you get to mold into different designs. Whereas truly shaped tarps, say a tarp with a catenary cut on the ridge line, or say a tarp that looks almost exactly like a tent except it doesn't have bug netting and a bathtub floor, those kinds of tarps, you can really only set them up in one way. So you lose a little bit of the flexibility, but with shaped tarps, you really gain a lot of extra protection. You know, a lot of shaped tarps will be totally covered on 3 of the 4 sides, or 4 of the 4 sides. So shaped tarps are a really great option if you want more protection and you don't mind losing a little bit of the flexibility. Now, as a rule of thumb, when it comes to the size of a tarp, I would say that the bigger the better, because it's going to offer you more options in the way you can pitch it, and it's going to give you much more protection. So a tarp is just a big flat square rectangle. Well, how do you then set it up? Well, I'd like to talk about two of my favorites and two of the most standard ways you could ever pitch a tarp. And that is the A-frame and the half pyramid. So as you're about to notice, both of these ways, you kinda sorta set them up the exact same way. Still, we'll go through it as it is just Tarp 101, a half pyramid and an A-frame. So for an A-frame, what you want to do is first stake out the back two corners. With all of the corners, you kind of want to stake them out in a 45-degree angle coming off the tarp. Once you've staked out the back two corners, you want to come around to the front and stake out the front ridge line. You do this with a trekking pole, but a trekking pole isn't necessary. You could use a stick or tie it off to a tree, and you could tie it off higher or lower depending if you want more protection from storms or more space underneath it if the weather's looking good. So here you see how I set it up with my trekking pole. I just do one loop right around the top, and then I go stake it out. I have never ever had a problem doing it this way. Your trekking pole will develop these little creases in it, but you could always flip your trekking pole upside down and use this end instead if you want to kind of avoid that. So with the back two staked out and the very front, now you kind of created a big triangle. And from here, you want to stake out the front two corners. So again, staking them out at about a 45-degree angle away from the tarp. And then you go around to the back side of the tarp and you want to stake out the back ridge line. So now your tarp is lifted off the ground and it truly has shape. Then from here, you're basically done, and you can stake off any of the little extra bits or tie outs in any order that you want. If the weather's great, if it's not windy, you don't even need to do them at all. They really just add more rigidity to your shelter and help to protect you when you're underneath it in a storm. Now an A-frame for me, as I have it set up here, is kind of the best default tarp pitch. If I was going out and hiking the Pacific Crest Trail or the Continental Divide Trail or the Arizona Trail, I would just have my tarp set up in an A-frame from the get-go. But I like an A-frame most because it feels like it gives me the best protection. I can set it up really low in bad storms, or I can raise it really high and have tons and tons and tons of space underneath it. So all around, start out with an A-frame and then move on from there. Now let's look at the half pyramid. Now again, just like the A-frame, you want to go to the back of the tarp and stake out the back two corners at a 45-degree angle. And then you're going to want to come around to the very front of the tarp and stake out the front ridge line using a trekking pole or sticks or whatever. Then of course you stake out the front two corners, and with the half pyramid, you're basically done here. You don't actually need to do anything more, and again, all of these extra little pullouts from here, you could stake them out if a storm is coming or if it's windy, and you can stake them out in any order that you like. So a half pyramid, I find, is just simple, easy, and fast. It has a few less steps than setting up an A-frame. It's a little bit easier to set up than an A-frame. You only need one trekking pole or one stick compared to at least two with an A-frame. And so on trips where I'm not really expecting a ton of rain, I will use a half pyramid. Three little tricks that you can utilize with any of your tarp setups. The first of which is you can lift up a side with extra sticks. So I could easily pin this down to the ground for more protection, or I could have it much higher if I want more headroom. Now the second tip that I have here is that on your tarp setup, I want you to make one of the lines a different color. Typically one in the front, and preferably the ridge line. That way, when it's raining, it's storming, you're trying to set up your tarp really fast, you immediately know when you whip that thing out of your pack which side your head is going to be on. Now, my last little tip here is to use pullouts. Now, what this is going to do is when I pin this out, stake it to the ground, it pulls the tarp outward. So I think you can see when I pull this out, not only does it make the tarp tighter, a better pitch, more storm worthy, but it's also giving myself a lot more space underneath. Now the next thing I'd like to talk about is the length of your guy lines. All these lines that are coming off the corners and the ridge line of your tarp. Now in general though, when it comes to setting up your guy lines, I would say as a rule of thumb, the longer the better, because you can always cut them shorter very, very easily. Whereas once you've cut them too short, then you need to go out, you need to buy more line, and you need to retie all your knots, and it kind of becomes a big process. So definitely start out on the longer side, and then as you use the tarp, you can kind of cut them shorter and shorter depending on what you find you need and you actually use. So I took some notes based on how I set up my guy lines. For the ridge line, this one in the front and the one in the back, I want that to be the absolute longest so I can set it up and tie it off to trees and bushes, and really, you know, the ridge line is probably the most important, so I want that one to be a little bit longer. So you will cut 2 lines in roughly 7 to 9 feet. And then for all 4 corners, at roughly 5 to 6 feet. In time, you may find that you want 2 of those lines to remain at 6 feet, and then 2 of those lines you could cut down to like 4 feet or something. But to start out with, I would just make them all the same length, roughly 5 to 6 feet for the 4 corners. And then for any little extra pullouts you may have on the sides of the tarp, I just do roughly 2 to 3 feet. These are, I'd say, the least important, and really they're just there in heavy storms. So cutting them extra small, just 2 to 3 feet, is good because you really just want them to add that extra protection and that extra like tightness to your tarp, where it's really all these other lines that add the shape to the tarp. Okay, so you've cut your guy lines. Well, then what kind of knots are you going to use to attach your guy line to your tarp, to attach your guy line to your tent stakes? And there are 2 knots in particular, but first I want to talk about something else. Some tarps will come with line locks. This tarp right here, I have line locks on it. So line locks kind of make everything a little bit easier because you just pull on the string and it tightens the tarp, and it's great. You probably have line locks on your tent, so you're already a little familiar with it. Now, if you want to save some weight, line locks don't weigh too much, but you know, if you're using a tarp, you probably want to save weight, huh? I find that, you know, just using 2 different knots work basically the same, and they're really not much harder. Once you set them up, you're good to go, and you don't really have to think about it ever again if you don't want to. So the 2 knots that I use are the bow line hitch and the taut line hitch. So the bow line hitch is what I use to attach my guy line to the tarp. I find that it's a very, very sturdy knot. It's never going to come undone, and that is what I've been using for over 10 years now to attach my guy line to my tarp. Now, to make a loop on the other end, to attach your guy line to your tent stake, I use a taut line hitch. Now, this is kind of a slip knot. So instead of using line locks, you use a taut line hitch to be able to adjust your knot and adjust your guy line to be shorter or longer. So in the same vein, if you're using line locks, then you don't need the taut line hitch, and you can just use a bow line at the tent stake side. So I set up my tarp with these knots and these lengths of guy lines before I leave, and then I'm totally good to go, and I basically don't touch those knots again until I go to the next trip. Okay, so when using a tarp, you don't have bug netting and you don't have a bathtub floor. So at the very least, what you're going to need is some kind of ground sheet. You want something to lay on the ground to then be able to sleep on top of. So the 2 different styles of ground sheets you want, one of them I'm sitting on right now, and this is Tyvek. Tyvek is used in building homes, and it can be bought for very, very cheap. And this piece of Tyvek is going to last you years and years and years and not get any holes in it or be any worse than when you first bought it. So Tyvek is very, very, very durable. Now, the other option for a ground sheet is Polycryo. Polycryo is much lighter than Tyvek. I think a Polycryo sheet will weigh about 1 ounce, whereas a Tyvek sheet will weigh closer to 5 ounces. But Polycryo is not going to be as durable, so it's not going to last you as long. So it kind of depends. Do you want the lightest ground sheet possible, or do you want the most durable ground sheet possible? Now, one of the beauties of using a tarp that has a ground sheet instead of a tent which has an integrated bathtub floor is that eventually your tent's bathtub floor is going to get holes in it. It is an inevitability. It's going to happen. Whereas your ground sheet, if it happens to get holes in it, you can easily replace it. Whereas with a tent and your bathtub floor, that is not very easy to replace. So a ground sheet's very easy to replace, and that is one of the beauties of them. Now another beauty of the ground sheet is if I'm setting up my tarp in the rain, I just set up the tarp and I can come under here and I can then go through my gear in a nice dry and safe space before I get out my dry ground sheet. Whereas with a tent, you're setting up your tent in the rain, the bathtub floor is getting water in it, and then you have to get in on top of your bathtub floor when you yourself are also wet. With a ground sheet, you take it out, it's totally dry, you've already changed into your dry clothes, and now you get to sleep very, very comfortably and happily. So the ground sheets have a lot of benefits. There's two main options you want to go with, either Tyvek or Polycryo, and yeah, it's just another beauty of the tarp. Now the next thing I want to talk about is site selection. Where you're choosing to camp, because a lot of problems you're probably already thinking about in your head with the tarp are totally solved with some site selection. So first, since we were talking about ground sheets and bathtub floors, a tarp doesn't have a bathtub floor that's going to protect you from 5 inches of standing water. But also, you probably shouldn't camp in a location that's going to have 5 inches of standing water, or frankly, even 1 centimeter of standing water. So with site selection, one of the things you want to look for is you don't want to camp in a spot that's going to potentially flood. So I look for areas where I'm sleeping on top of leaves and duff and grass, because that'll allow water to percolate underneath me and away from me. I want to look for spots that aren't dished or like in a ditch where water is going to collect and pool. And over all my years of using a tarp, I have never ever once had a problem with water coming up and over my ground sheet and onto my sleeping bag or stuff like that. Now another thing a tarp doesn't have is a bug net, and that's another thing that site selection can really help with. So if you're camping in an environment that has some mosquitoes, that has some bugs, what you can do is camp away from water, because bugs breed in water. So if you're camping near a lake, if you're camping near a pond or a swamp or a bog, that's going to be way more buggy. Whereas if you're camping in a dry environment or a dry location, even just a quarter mile away from that water source, it is going to have way less bugs. Another thing you can do with bugs is set up in an area that has a breeze blowing through or has more wind coming through that area. So maybe something that's not quite as tightly dense with trees and plants. Bugs are small and they're heavily influenced by the wind. So if you're camping in a windy place, bugs, again, just aren't really a problem. You combine those two tips and now you don't really have to deal with the bugs nearly as much. My third little tip for site selection is, since a tarp is open on at least one side, most likely, you want to find a spot that does have some trees, that does have some bushes and some rocks. So you can position yourself so that you are right up against a bush, a tree, or a rock, so that it can aid in your protection if it's really windy or if a big storm is coming in. Just to summarize all this, basically, is I would get at least a 7x9 tarp or a 9x10 tarp. I would get it in the fabric of Silpoly. Silpoly is going to be significantly cheaper than dyneema, which I have here, and yet Silpoly is going to be basically just as good. And I would personally buy a flat tarp instead of a shaped tarp. Obviously, shaped tarps are great. You can use them in all sorts of things. They provide extra protection. But I feel like a flat tarp to just start out with is really fun to play around with. You can try the different shapes and, you know, you kind of get to the feel for what you like the most. And maybe you'll find what you like the most is a flat tarp and you're not really lacking anything. Now, especially it's perfect because what I want you to do once you get that 7x9 flat tarp is I want you to take it out on trips where you're expecting the weather to be good. You're expecting there to be no bugs. You're taking it out in the best conditions basically possible and giving yourself the best chance possible to actually enjoy using the tarp. That way you can see what it's like at its best, and then later on you can take it in more difficult conditions once you've learned how to use it. So that is what I'd recommend if you're just starting out. You do not have to spend much money on this. It's just something that's fun to try. A tarp is just, it's never going to be good in every single situation imaginable. I think it is just another piece in the puzzle when it comes to the gear in your closet. It's something fun to use, it's something flexible, and I've gotten a lot of enjoyment out of it over the years. Am I going to do every single trip ever of my entire life with a tarp instead of a tent? No. There's just a lot of situations where a tent is going to be better. So anyway, that is my tarp masterclass, let's say. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned a lot. I hope you try a tarp yourself. In the description below, I'll leave links to some of my favorite tarps and tarps that I recommend, but honestly, there's not much to them. It's just a big square piece of fabric. You can make one yourself. So anyway, thanks for watching. Give this video a like, subscribe to this channel, and yeah, catch you guys next time.